I first went to the freight depot on West 17th Street in Cheyenne because the file said it was ordinary. The city archives describe it as a standard Union Pacific brick freight house, completed in 1887, one more structure added after the railroad's arrival in 1867 turned this patch of prairie into what historians call the magic city of the plains. There is an image from around 1888, a glass plate photograph of the depot, tracks, and almost nothing else. Rows of perfectly laid brick arches, a stone plinth course, too refined for a frontier shed, and half hidden in shadow, a recessed vaulted chamber below the loading dock, marked simply "pump room" in a penciled note on the reverse. It was that chamber that unsettled me. Its dimensions and symmetry looked less like a small town freight basement and more like the hydraulic sublevels I had seen under St. Pancras in London. Some alternative researchers would call this a Tartarian footprint, overbuilt substructure, anomalous vaulting, unexplained hydraulic capacity beneath what the documents insist is a simple 19th century warehouse. I did not reach a conclusion that evening. I only noted that on maps printed 2 centuries earlier, this entire region appears under a single name, Great Tartary. The investigation opens with that Cheyenne freight depot. Official city records state that the first tents on the site went up in July 1867, when Union Pacific surveyors marked the crossing at Crow Creek and laid out temporary headquarters. The town plat was recorded 3 years later. The brick freight house on West 17th appears in a railroad inventory as completed autumn 1887. On screen, I examine the earliest known photograph, a barren plain, tracks, the long brick rectangle of the depot, and only scattered wooden structures around it. The stone foundation is precise, alternating rusticated granite blocks and red brick, the mortar joints razor thin. The northeast corner shows a sealed arch at ground level that does not correspond to any doorway on surviving plans. The construction file lists a railroad engineer. Grenville M. Dodge is named on the city plat, and a lesser-known company architect signs the depot elevation, but no detail about that undercroft. There is, however, a later maintenance note from 1903 referring to flooding in lower vaults adjacent to hydraulic apparatus. I measure the bays, the brick courses, the symmetry of the arches. For a freight shed built on the edge of a half-finished town, the geometry is unexpectedly exact. It resembles, in miniature, the brick viaduct modules described in late 19th century papers on masonry railway bridges, not improvised frontier work. I close this first examination on a quiet observation. The depot masonry looks like it was designed for a much larger system than the town that grew around it. Some Tartaria researchers would say the building is not the origin point, but an interface to something older. A question lingers. Why does the basement look finished decades before the city above it does? City histories of Cheyenne repeat the same line. The town exists because the railroad chose this point in 1867 and everything else followed. The Union Pacific timeline shows track crews here in November of that year, long before substantial civic architecture existed. Yet when I pull a Sanborn Fire insurance map from 1901, the freight house footprint is drawn with thick masonry walls and shaded interior vaults, while many surrounding buildings are still wooden. The map symbols identify brick, fireproof, and in tiny script under the platform, hydraulic lift. There is a short article in an engineering journal from 1902 noting the installation of a water-powered cargo elevator in a Western freight facility, drawing power from city mains in the same way hydraulic lifts were starting to appear in industrial buildings by the 1870s and 80s. The dimensions in that article fit the mysterious pump room. In the official narrative, this is straightforward. A growing railroad town modernized its freight handling. but the first photograph shows the brick shell and undercroft complete when the town is still scarcely more than track, tents, and a few false front stores. The infrastructure seems to precede the population. On my desk lies a facsimile of an 18th century map by Ortelius, its vast inland expanse labelled Tartaria. The coordinates roughly match what would later be called the Great Plains and Inner West, part of a vague Great Tartary in some European atlases. Mainstream historians see only cartographic shorthand. Alternative researchers see an erased network, which they call Tartarian infrastructure, hidden beneath later construction. The chapter ends on a simple tension. If the depot was merely an appendage to a newborn town, why do its buried systems look like the anchor, not the appendage? In a second visit to the Cheyenne archive, I request renovation documents. A thin folder, dated 1931, describes infilling of obsolete vault opening on the north wall and removal of redundant piping presumed original to construction. The contractor's sketch marks a bricked-up arch at the exact position I had traced on the exterior. An unlabeled photograph from the 1920s shows a work crew standing in front of the depot. Behind them, the north wall still bears the outline of a large arched opening, now closed in darker brick. At ground level, faint traces of an iron frame are visible, as if a hatch or lift platform once existed there. The document's language is telling. It records redundant piping, original to construction, yet no mechanical equipment is ever described in the initial 1887 plans. If hydraulic lifts were added decades later, why did the renovation report treat the undercroft equipment as original? I compare the arch proportions to those under St Pancras Station in London, where the Midland Railway built a forest of brick vaults and installed hydraulic lifts to lower beer wagons into an undercroft designed from the start as vast storage space. The spacing of columns there shows a level of premeditated modular design that some Tartaria enthusiasts argue reflects an inherited engineering language, what they call the Tartarian architectural signature. Here in Cheyenne, the undercroft is smaller, but the pattern feels familiar. Vaulted substructure, undeclared hydraulic capacity, an opening later sealed and forgotten. To see whether this pattern extends beyond Wyoming, I turn to Novosibirsk. Official histories describe it as a classic railroad town, founded in June 1893 as Novonikolaevsk at the site chosen for a Trans-Siberian railway bridge over the Ob River. The bridge was built between 1893 and 1897, its 9 steel spans resting on massive granite piers sunk into bedrock. I study an early photograph, the wide river, the new bridge, a temporary workers' settlement on the near bank, and on the far shore a solitary masonry abutment flanked by carefully cut retaining walls, but almost no urban fabric behind them. Once again, the high-precision structure appears before the city. Engineering documents describe the pier's caissons, some sunk over 7 meters below low water, and the granite ashlar carefully laid above them. The quality of the stonework seems out of proportion to the modest wooden station buildings visible in early images. On my table is a reproduction of a 19th century Western European map, labeling this vast interior as Great Tartary. In online forums, Tartarian researchers note that some of the earliest, most monumental rail structures stand alone in empty terrain, precisely in regions once mapped as Tartaria. The Trans-Siberian was an immense, documented construction project. Yet the speed with which massive granite piers appeared in wilderness locations and the precision of their stonework echoes what I observed in Cheyenne, infrastructure that seems to arrive fully formed, waiting for the town that will later justify it. Back in London, the undercroft of St Pancras Station, opened in 1868 as the Midland Railway's new terminus, offers a rare, well-documented example of extensive subterranean infrastructure. The brick vaults under the platforms were designed specifically to store Burton beer, their column spacing calculated exactly to fit standard barrels. Photographs from the early 20th century show endless rows of casks beneath the iron train shed. At the station throat, a hydraulic lift once lowered beer-laden wagons into this underworld, a piece of equipment visible in images from the 1930s and referenced later by railway historians. Here, unlike Cheyenne, the lift is not entirely erased. There are photographs, diagrams, and even a note in a contemporary article about the efficient handling of goods by hydraulic mechanism. Victorian engineering journals discuss water-powered lifts and hoists becoming common in industrial settings by the late 19th century, in line with broader adoption of hydraulic elevators and stage lifts. Mainstream history thus has no trouble explaining the technology. What troubles me as I compare St Pancras Undercroft plans to the Cheyenne vault sketch is the modular language, identical arch spans, regular grids of columns, and similar concealed lift positions. On 19th century maps that still label parts of Siberia and Central Asia as Tartary, enthusiasts see a recurring combination of monumental above-ground architecture and buried utility floors that resemble this Undercroft pattern, which they call the Tartarian infrastructure template. The chapter closes with a restrained reflection. Perhaps the Cheyenne Depot's Undercroft is simply a provincial echo of a well-known British model, or perhaps both are instances of a deeper, shared design grammar that Tartaria researchers are trying, clumsily at times, to name. The similarity across continents, in structures built within decades of each other, in regions once united only by the label Tartaria, is difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Grand Central Terminal, opened in 1913, is fully within the documented electrical and hydraulic age. Yet beneath it lies a hidden sub-basement electrical substation carved into bedrock called M42. It began as a steam plant in 1918 and was converted into a major alternating current to direct current power facility by 1930. For decades, M42 did not appear on public maps or blueprints. Its existence was acknowledged only in the late 20th century. Photographs from a modern tour show rows of transformers, remnants of rotary converters, and a 30-ton overhead crane. It is pure modern infrastructure, no mystery there. What interests me is the pattern, a major rail terminal sitting atop a hidden, power-focused sub-level, accessed through discrete hatches and corridors unknown to the average passenger. The official Grand Central history details its construction, designers, and later alterations, but the casual visitor has no sense of the station's depth. Alternative Tartaria narratives often point to such hidden levels and suggest that some earlier stations and depots might have had analogous, now sealed, energetic chambers whose original purpose is no longer understood. It is a large step from M42 to a hypothetical Tartarian infrastructure, and mainstream historians reject that connection. Still, as I compare the Cheyenne renovation note about underground mechanisms of unknown purpose to a Grand Central maintenance report that proudly describes subterranean complexity, I am struck by a stark contrast. Some basements are celebrated and others are bricked up and forgotten. Tartarian researchers pose a simple question: why the difference? What determines which underground systems are preserved in the record and which are erased? The chapter ends on an understated observation. In rail architecture, the most critical systems are often buried out of sight. When the documents that explain them go missing, the stone and iron remain mute. In that silence, the Tartarian hypothesis finds its foothold. With building-level cases on the table, I widen the frame to the pattern suggested in the title. Railways that came before the towns. Cheyenne is one example. The Union Pacific arrival in 1867 preceded the city charter by a year and the substantial civic buildings by considerably longer. Novosibirsk is another example, founded as a small settlement only when the Ob Bridge site was chosen in 1893. In both cases, the infrastructure preceded the population that would later justify it. Railway historians note many such railroad towns worldwide, sidings, depots, and junctions that seeded later municipalities. Officially, this is simple economic logic. The rail network drives settlement, and towns grow around the stations. Yet in several early photographs from these locations, I notice a similar oddity that the official narrative does not address. Sophisticated masonry works, bridges, embankments, and freight houses with vaulted undercrofts, standing amid tents, shacks, and empty land. The contrast is jarring. The infrastructure looks permanent, while the town looks temporary. A technical article on masonry railway bridges observes that by the late 19th century, designers had refined arch theory and could mass-produce durable brick and stone structures to standardized specifications. The skill existed, the pattern books existed. Still, the decision to invest such refined work in isolated locations before any substantial town appears is a choice that requires more explanation than optimism about future traffic. On my desk is a 17th century engraved map by Hondius that labels a huge swathe of northern Asia, Tartaria. It is dotted with schematic towns and stylized fortifications along river routes that, centuries later, would become rail corridors. Modern Tartaria theorists overlay these maps with 19th century rail alignments and see a continuity that mainstream historians dismiss. They describe infrastructure grids reactivated along old corridors, iron roads following paths that Tartarian civilization had established centuries earlier, stations rising on foundations that were already there, waiting. I do not claim that. I simply note that in more than one case the railroad brings with it not just track, but high-precision stone and brick structures that look in photographs as if they were always meant to be there, waiting for a town that had not yet arrived. The pattern is too consistent across too many sites to ignore entirely. The chapter's question is not an answer, but an invitation. Are these overbuilt works simply optimistic investments in future traffic, or do they hint at an inherited template applied wherever the iron roads extended into territories once mapped as Tartaria? The coincidence of alignment between old Tartarian maps and new railroad routes may mean nothing, or it may mean that 19th century surveyors were following traces they did not fully understand. Returning to the Cheyenne renovation file, I focus on terminology. The 1931 contractor refers to removal of redundant machinery from lower vault and blocking up of access passage without specifying the type of machinery removed. There is no corresponding purchase order for new equipment. The work is purely subtractive. Something was taken away and the opening sealed, but the records do not say what. The silence in the archive is as significant as the words. In London, St Pancras received similar clearance during its late 20th century redevelopment. Parts of the undercroft were opened up, others reconfigured, some columns and cross-bracing removed. Photographers documented strange crossplates on columns that seemed designed to support something heavy that was no longer there, mounting brackets with no corresponding equipment, anchor bolts set in patterns that matched no known Victorian machinery. Railway historians attributed these to beer barrel storage racks or temporary wartime modifications, but the exact purpose of some fixtures remains uncertain even after detailed study. I place photographs of the Cheyenne Undercroft sketch, St Pancras beer vaults, and a generic masonry viaduct interior side by side on my desk. Each shows repeating arches, robust piers, and in some cases unexplained anchor points. The specific functions differ: beer storage in London, bridge bearings in railway viaducts, freight handling in Cheyenne, but the underlying geometries converge with uncomfortable precision. The arch spans are nearly identical. The column spacing follows the same modular rhythm. The proportions of the vaults could be interchanged without visible disruption. Tartarian-oriented researchers often fixate on such recurring vault modules, claiming they once housed free energy devices or advanced hydraulic networks that powered a lost civilization spanning the territories once labeled Tartaria. Mainstream engineering history has no evidence for this extraordinary claim. It sees only familiar structural economies repeated across the industrial world. The similarity, conventional historians argue, reflects shared engineering education and pattern books circulating through the same professional networks, not a hidden Tartarian inheritance predating the industrial age. My own discomfort is quieter and harder to dismiss. When machinery is removed and passages bricked up without clear documentation, future observers are left with structure divorced from purpose. We see the container but not the contents. We see the mounting brackets but not what they mounted. In that gap between physical evidence and archival silence, speculative narratives flourish. The Tartarian hypothesis may be wrong in its specifics, but it exists because the archives have holes large enough to walk through, holes that official history does not acknowledge and cannot explain. The chapter ends by noting a simple cause and effect. The more renovation erases old systems without recording them, the easier it becomes to imagine that those systems belong to someone else entirely, to the Tartarian builders whose name once covered these maps and whose infrastructure, some researchers insist, still lies beneath our feet. Many large 19th century rail yards exhibit radial patterns, with tracks fanning out from roundhouses and turntables in geometric precision. Historical photographs show circular or polygonal arrangements around a central pivot, spokes radiating from a hub. On 19th century maps of Great Tartary, engraved fortifications often appear as star-shaped bastions with radiating walls. These star forts appear across the Tartarian territories in consistent geometric forms. Modern alternative researchers draw a visual parallel between these star forts and later rail yards, arguing for a shared geometrical language, what they call Tartarian star patterns. In one case study, I overlay a plan of an early roundhouse complex in the Russian interior with a star fort engraving from the same region 2 centuries earlier. The resemblance is superficial but striking: spokes, central hub, encircling perimeter. The purposes are entirely different, yet the geometry echoes across the centuries with uncomfortable precision. Architectural historians would attribute both to practical considerations. This is the conventional explanation, and it is plausible. Yet when similar radial layouts appear at new railheads in territories once labeled Tartary, the correlation fuels speculative interpretations. The pattern is too consistent, too widespread, too precise to attribute entirely to coincidence. Where the Tartarian hypothesis enters is in the unexplained hydraulic features. Sealed cisterns under small depots that never had documented hydraulic equipment, oversized culverts beneath lightly used sidings that carried far more water than surface drainage would require, and brick vaults with no apparent contemporary function, but damp walls and sediment lines suggesting decades of water flow through channels that no blueprint shows. In one 19th century engineering report from an unspecified western station, a line mentions removal of underground mechanisms of unknown purpose during yard modernization. The description is too vague to tie definitively to Tartaria, or even to a specific site, yet the phrase resonates with what I have seen in Cheyenne. Unknown purpose is the key. The engineers who removed the mechanisms did not know what they were for, which means the mechanisms predated the institutional memory of the railroad itself. Some alternative researchers interpret such traces as evidence of an inherited hydraulic grid used for more than just locomotives. They describe a Tartaria water power network that the railroad builders tapped into rather than created, a system of pressurized water distribution that spanned territories once labeled Tartaria and that powered technologies we no longer understand. There is no direct proof for this extraordinary claim. There are, however, physical volumes of brick and stone that once held water and now hold only questions. I close this chapter by stating the minimal fact. Railroads consistently buried complex water systems beneath their visible structures. In a few places, those systems predate clear records. The water was there before the documentation that should explain it. That ambiguity is the space where Tartaria enters the conversation, not as proven history, but as a persistent shadow over evidence that the official narrative cannot fully illuminate. By now, the investigation has accumulated several strands. Early railheads with city-grade masonry appear in near-empty landscapes. Undercrofts and vaults with hydraulic traces were later sealed. Radial yard geometries echo older Starfort engravings. Maps once labeled vast inland regions Tartary, and then those labels fell out of use. Mainstream scholarship on Tartary is clear and dismissive. It was a vague European term for Central and Northern Asia, not the name of a unified empire or advanced civilization. The Trans-Siberian Railway construction is well documented. The Union Pacific westward push is exhaustively charted. The bridges and depots I have examined all have known engineers, contractors, and surviving drawings. There is no archival smoking gun proving a Tartarian origin. And yet certain details remain stubbornly under-described. Why would a frontier freight depot need a finished hydraulic vault before the town existed? Why would a contractor call original machinery redundant without naming it? Why could a sub-basement labeled M42 exist for decades off the public record, while similar chambers in smaller depots were bricked up and forgotten? Why did water appear in underground chambers before municipal systems existed to supply it? The Tartaria frame does not resolve these puzzles. It reframes them. It suggests that what looks like first construction may, in some cases, be refurbishment of older infrastructure. It suggests that 19th century engineers sometimes worked atop systems whose origins they did not fully understand. The hypothesis is unprovable with current evidence. It is also unfalsifiable because the archives themselves are incomplete. I began expecting to catalogue Victorian brickwork and find simple explanations. I end uncertain where Victorian agency stops and older patterns begin. The name Tartaria may be a mirage projected onto ambiguous evidence, but the gaps in the record that give that mirage space to exist are real. The more I compare, the more the question of inheritance arises. At Novosibirsk, the granite piers sit on bedrock, but the site was chosen for its natural rock outcrop, a foundation waiting under alluvial soil as if the river crossing had been marked long before the surveyors arrived. At Cheyenne, the depot vaults reuse a brick module close to established British railway practice, yet the undercroft appears complete before the town has running water or paved streets. Everywhere, 19th century engineers stand on something: geological advantages, prior urban grids, earlier industrial works. The Tartaria hypothesis, in its more sober form, asks whether some of those somethings might include inherited infrastructural templates from a previous culture across what was once called Great Tartary. The theory proposes not magic and not free energy, just continuity. Engineering knowledge passed down through channels the official record does not acknowledge. Most academic historians would say no, pointing to the continuous documented evolution of civil engineering. The arch, the vault, the hydraulic press, all have clear genealogies in Western technical literature. They are likely correct. The conventional explanation accounts for most of the evidence, yet I cannot ignore how often railroads seem to slot into landscape features and substructures with uncanny neatness, especially in former Tartary regions. nor can I dismiss maintenance notes that speak of unknown machinery or photographs that show sealed arches no plan accounts for. In this chapter, I do not claim a global Tartarian empire. I simply suggest that our story of railways as entirely new creations might be incomplete. Some lines, some depots, some vaults may be palimpsests, industrial age script written over older, partially erased text. The documentary returns in the final scene to the original Cheyenne depot photograph. I zoom in on the north wall, the faint outline of the now sealed arch, the shadowed suggestion of a void behind it. On the table beside it lies the Hondius map marked Tartaria, linked by centuries of naming and forgetting, by territories labelled and then unlabelled, by infrastructure built and then buried. Sealed, I note that the arch's proportions match those of lift shafts drawn in a London undercroft, that the masonry joints are too fine for a hastily built shed, that the renovation file gives no details of what was taken away. The physical evidence is clear. The explanation is not. Evidence I acknowledge that Tartaria, as scholars understand it, was a label on maps, not a proven empire. The hypothesis is speculative. The academic consensus rejects it. I am not here to overturn that consensus. Tartaria. Then I let the two images, the map and the photograph, share the screen in silence. Silence. The pattern I have traced is not proof. It is accumulation, undercrofts with hydraulic traces in frontier depots, monumental bridges appearing before towns, radial geometries echoing star fort engravings, sealed chambers and removed machinery described in renovation files but never explained. Across continents, in regions once united only by the label Tartary, these signatures repeat with a consistency that coincidence alone struggles to explain. Pattern. The mainstream explanation leaves gaps. The Tartarian hypothesis fills those gaps with speculation. Neither is fully satisfying. What I am left with is not a conclusion, but a question. Were 19th century railroad builders creating something new, or were they, consciously or not, reconnecting to something older, following traces they could sense but not name, building on foundations whose origins had already been forgotten? Question. The final echo is not a thesis, but an archival detail. A small penciled note on the back of the depot photograph reads simply, "Vault, purpose unknown." Vault. The camera lingers on that word, unknown, long enough to invite the viewer to ask whether our railways stand only on our own ingenuity, or also on foundations whose memory we have allowed to fall out of the record, along with the name that once covered so much of the map, Tartaria. Unknown. The question remains open. The sealed arch remains closed. And somewhere beneath the freight house on West 17th Street, the vault still waits, its purpose unknown, its builders unnamed, its connection to the Tartarian pattern neither proven nor disproven, only silently, persistently, suggested by stone and brick and mortar joints, too precise for a frontier shed in a town that did not yet exist. Open